The silver escape pod screamed through the atmosphere of the unknown planet, and Princess Vela gripped the emergency straps with trembling hands as alarms blared all around her, and red warning lights flashed across every surface of the small craft, and she knew this was not how royalty was supposed to die, but the universe did not care about titles or bloodlines when systems failed. The pod hit the first layer of trees, and the impact threw Vela forward against the restraints, and then it crashed through another layer and another, and branches tore at the metal hull with sounds like screaming. And finally the pod slammed into soft earth, and everything went silent, except for the ringing in Vela's long, pointed ears. She sat frozen, for several heartbeats, just breathing and feeling grateful to be alive. And then her training kicked in, and she reached up with shaking fingers to release the restraints and pushed the emergency hatch release, and the door hissed open and cool. Air rushed in, carrying scents she had never smelled before. Vela stumbled out onto moss-covered ground, and her legs barely held her weight, and she looked around at the towering trees and the filtered sunlight and the strange plants growing everywhere, and her amber eyes went wide with fear because this was not a civilized world, and her scanner had marked it as primitive and potentially dangerous before the crash. She was Princess Vela of the Herolan species, and her pale lavender skin bore the bioluminescent patterns that proved her royal bloodline, and those patterns now pulsed with anxiety as she realized how far from home she truly was, and her people would search for her. But space was vast, and it could take weeks or even months to find her. The worst part was the information her ship computer had given her before it died, and this planet was inhabited by a species called humans, and they were omnivores, and that single word had sent ice through Vela's blood, because omnivores ate meat, and that meant they hunted and killed, and every instinct in her herbivore body screamed danger. Vela pressed her long ears flat against her skull and moved back to the damaged pod to assess what supplies she had, and the emergency kit contained water purification tablets and some nutrition bars and a basic medical kit, and a communication beacon that she activated immediately, and the beacon would send a distress signal, but it had limited range, and she could only hope a Herolan ship passed close enough to detect it. Night was falling, and Vela had never been alone like this, and at the royal palace on her homeworld, she had been surrounded by guards and servants and advisors, and now she had nothing but a broken pod and a forest full of unknown dangers, and she climbed back inside the pod because at least it offered some shelter, and she sealed the door and curled up in the pilot seat and tried not to think about predators. The darkness outside was complete, and Vela could hear sounds through the hull and rustling and calls of creatures she could not identify, and her heart raced with every noise, and she was a princess, but she felt like prey, and she hated that feeling, and she promised herself she would survive this and make it home. Morning came slowly, and Vela had barely slept, and when light filtered through the pod windows, she felt brave enough to venture outside again, and she needed to find water and maybe some plants she could eat, and her scanner still worked even if the communication system was damaged, and she could at least test things for toxins. She gathered her scanner and some containers from the emergency kit and stepped out into the morning air. And the forest was beautiful, in the daylight, with shafts of golden sun breaking through the canopy and birds singing in the trees. And for a moment Vela forgot to be afraid. Then she heard footsteps, and they were heavy and deliberate, and coming closer, and Vela froze completely, still like prey animals do when they sense a predator, and her ears swiveled toward the sound, and her breathing became rapid and shallow. A human male stepped into the clearing near her pod, and Vela had seen images of humans in the cultural database, but seeing one in person was completely different, and he was tall and broad across the shoulders, and his skin was darkened by sun, and his hair was dark and tied back from his face. He wore strange clothing that looked designed for wilderness survival. And most terrifying of all, he had tools hanging from his belt, and some of those tools had blades and could easily be weapons, and Vela took a step backward and pressed herself against the pod, and every muscle in her body tensed for flight. Human stopped when he saw her, and his eyes went wide with shock, and he stared at her like she was the most surprising thing he had ever seen. And for a long moment, neither of them moved, and Vela could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, the human slowly raised both hands with palms facing toward her, and it might have been a peaceful gesture, but Vela could not trust it, and she knew predators could be patient and clever, and she backed further against the pod with her ears flat, and her bioluminescent patterns flickering with fear. The human spoke, and his voice was deep but somehow gentle, and the words made no sense to Vela, because her translator chip needed time to calibrate to new languages, and she just stared at him, with wide, frightened eyes, and wished she had any kind of weapon. The human seemed to understand that she could not understand him, and he moved very slowly and reached for something on his belt, and Vela nearly bolted into the forest. But she forced herself to stay still and watch. And he pulled out what looked like a container, and he held it up so she could see it clearly. Water and Vela could see liquid inside the transparent container, and the human set it down on the ground about halfway between them. And then he stepped back several paces and sat down on a fallen log, and he smiled, but he kept his mouth closed and did not show his teeth. Vela knew from the database that showing teeth was a threat display in many predator species, but humans sometimes smiled with closed mouths as a peaceful gesture, and she stared at the water container and then at the human, and she was so thirsty from the crash and the fear, but every instinct screamed, not to approach. The human just sat there on the log and made no move toward her, and after several minutes he started talking again in that gentle voice, and Vela translator chip began picking up patterns, and she caught a few words, and he was saying something about water and safety and help. But Vela did not know if she could trust a predator, even a predator who smiled and brought water, and she stayed pressed against her pod and watched him carefully and tried to control her racing heart, and wondered if this human would be her salvation or her doom. The human, whose name Vela would later learn was Daniel Hayes, sat on the fallen log for almost an hour, and he did not move toward her, and he did not make any threatening gestures, and eventually he stood up slowly and pointed to himself, and said a word that sounded like his name, and then he pointed toward the direction he had come from and made walking gestures, and he picked up a small branch and drew something in the dirt. Vela watched all of this with suspicious eyes, and she saw him draw what looked like a simple shelter, and then he pointed at the sky and made a circular motion that she interpreted as the sun moving, and he was telling her he would come back, and then he backed away, keeping his hands visible, and disappeared into the forest. Once he was gone, Vela waited several more minutes to be sure he was truly leaving, and then she crept forward and grabbed the water container and rushed back to her pod and sealed the door, and her hands shook as she opened the container and sniffed it and ran her scanner over it, and it was just water and clean water, and she drank half of it immediately. The rest of the day passed slowly, and Vela explored the immediate area around her pod, but never went far, and she found a small stream and tested it with her scanner and found it safe, and she filled her containers, and she found some plants that her database identified as similar to vegetation on her homeworld, and she ate carefully and sparingly. As evening approached, she heard footsteps again, and the human returned, and this time he carried a bundle, and he stopped at the same spot as before and unwrapped the bundle to reveal fruits and what looked like vegetables, and he set them down and backed away and sat on his log again. Vela translator chip had been working all day processing the words he had spoken, and when he started talking again she could understand perhaps one word in 5, and he was saying something about food and safe and eat, and he pointed to his own mouth and pretended to eat, and then pointed at the food. After he left, Vela retrieved the food and scanned everything, and it was all plant-based and safe for her biology. And she ate fresh fruit for the first time since the crash and nearly cried at how good it tasted, and maybe this human was not planning to harm her, and maybe he was genuinely trying to help. This pattern continued for 3 days, and every morning and evening, Daniel would come with food and water, and he would sit on his log and talk to her in that gentle voice, and he never tried to come closer. And Vela translator chip improved, and she began to understand more of what he said. He told her his name was Daniel, and he was a wilderness guide. And he lived alone in these mountains, and he had been checking his trail markers when he found her pod, and he had never seen anything like her before, and he thought she was beautiful. And that word made Vela patterns glow slightly, because no one had ever called her beautiful before, only proper or suitable or royal. On the 4th day, Vela finally spoke back, and her voice was musical compared to human speech, and she said her name. And Daniel smiled that closed-mouth smile and repeated it carefully, getting the pronunciation almost right. And he asked where she came from, and Vela pointed at the sky. Daniel nodded like that made sense, and he asked if she was hurt, and Vela shook her head, and he asked if she needed help, and Vela hesitated because she did need help, but she was still afraid, and Daniel seemed to understand, and he told her he would keep bringing food and water, and he would not hurt her, and he promised Vela wanted to believe him. And over the past days, she had watched him carefully, and he moved like a predator but gently, and he was patient in ways that predators were not when they hunted, and he had never once looked at her the way a hunter looks at prey. And maybe humans were different, and maybe not all predators were the same. That afternoon, Vela ventured further from her pod, and she followed the stream and found a place where it pooled, and the water was clear and deep, and she badly needed to wash, and she checked carefully to make sure Daniel was not around, and she removed her torn flight suit and slipped into the water. The cold made her gasp, but it felt wonderful, and she scrubbed away days of sweat and fear, and when she emerged, she felt more like herself, and she put her flight suit back on and walked back toward her pod and froze when she saw Daniel standing near it. He had his back turned and was examining the damage to the hull, and Vela's heart lurched with fear. But then she saw he had brought more supplies, and there was a tarp, and some rope, and tools, and he was not taking anything from her pod but bringing things to help repair it. Daniel turned and saw her, and he raised his hands in that peaceful gesture, and he explained slowly that he thought she might need shelter, and the pod was damaged, and he could help build something better, and he would only help if she wanted, and otherwise he would leave the supplies. And Vela looked at the supplies, and then at Daniel, and she made a decision, and she nodded and said yes in her language, and then in his language, and Daniel smiled and asked if she was sure, and Vela nodded again. They worked together that afternoon, and Daniel showed her how to string the tarp between trees to create a shelter, and he was careful never to touch her, and he explained everything he was doing, and Vela helped, and she was surprised at how good it felt to work alongside someone and not be alone. When the shelter was finished, it was much better than the pod, and Daniel had even made a small fire pit safely contained with stones, and he showed her how to start a fire. And Vela had never made fire before because her people used technology, and she watched fascinated as he created flames from friction. Daniel left before dark as always, and Vela sat by her new fire and felt warmth and something else, and she felt hope. And maybe she would survive this, and maybe this human was not a danger, and maybe she had been wrong to judge all predators the same. And she looked up at the stars and wondered if her people were searching, and if they would find her before she stopped wanting to be found. The fifth morning dawned with dark clouds, and Vela woke to the sound of thunder rumbling across the mountains, and she had seen storms in the weather data, but experiencing one on a primitive planet was different from watching it on screens at the palace, and the wind picked up quickly, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Daniel arrived earlier than usual, and he looked concerned, and he pointed at the sky and said something about a big storm coming, and the tarp shelter would not be enough. And he gestured toward the direction of his home and said she could come with him where it was safer. Vela hesitated because going to his dwelling felt like crossing a line. And what if it was a trap? And what if she was wrong about him? But the wind was getting stronger, and the tarp was already flapping violently, and she knew she could not survive a serious storm in such a flimsy shelter. She nodded and gathered her emergency pack, and Daniel led the way through the forest, and they had to hurry as the storm grew worse and rain began falling in sheets, and Vela had never been so wet and cold in her life, and her species did not regulate body temperature well in these conditions, and she started shivering badly. Daniel looked back and saw her struggling, and he slowed down and offered his hand, and Vela stared at it for a moment and then took it, and his hand was warm and strong, and he helped her over fallen logs and through rushing water that had not been there. Before his shelter was a small cabin built from wood and stone, and it looked sturdy and permanent, and Daniel opened the door and ushered her inside, and Vela stepped into warmth and dryness, and she stood there dripping on the floor and shaking from cold and relief. The cabin was simple but comfortable, and there was a stone fireplace with a fire already burning, and there were shelves with supplies and a sleeping area in one corner, and books and tools, and it looked lived in and cared for, and Daniel quickly grabbed blankets and brought them to Vela, and showed her where she could sit near the fire. Vela wrapped herself in the blankets and sat as close to the flames as she dared, and outside the storm unleashed its full fury, and rain hammered the roof and wind howled around the walls, and she had never been more grateful for solid shelter. Daniel moved around the cabin, checking the windows and making sure everything was secure. And then he prepared hot tea and brought her a cup, and Vela wrapped her cold hands around it and breathed in the steam and took a careful sip. And it was bitter, but warming, and she drank it gratefully. The storm lasted all day and into the night, and Daniel prepared food, and they ate together, and he told her about the mountains and the seasons and the animals that lived in the forest, and Vela listened and asked questions, and her translator was working perfectly now, and they could have real conversations. She told him about her homeworld, and her people and the Heralan Empire that spanned 3 systems, and she explained that her species was herbivore and peaceful and focused on art and philosophy and diplomacy, and Daniel listened with fascination and asked intelligent questions when Vela mentioned that her people never harmed other species. Daniel asked gently if that was why she had been so afraid of him, and Vela felt embarrassed, but she nodded and explained that humans were omnivores, and she had been taught that predator species were dangerous. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that surprised her, and he said he understood her fear, and he said humans had been predators for most of their evolution, but they had learned to be more than their instincts, and they had chosen to build civilizations and create art and help those who were different from them. He told her that humans were capable of violence but also capable of great kindness, and the choice between those things was what made them human, and he had chosen years ago to live peacefully and help others, and he would never harm her, and that was a promise he meant to keep. Vela looked at him across the firelight and saw sincerity in his eyes, and she realized she believed him, and somewhere in the past 5 days she had stopped seeing him as a predator and started seeing him as Daniel, and that was a shift that surprised her. The temperature dropped as night deepened, and even with the fire and blankets, Vela could not stop shivering, and her species needed warmth to survive, and the cold was becoming dangerous, and Daniel noticed, and he looked concerned. He asked very carefully if she would accept help to stay warm, and he explained that humans generated a lot of body heat, and he could share warmth with her if she trusted him enough, and he would not touch her inappropriately, and he would stay on top of the blankets and give her space. Vela knew she needed help, and she was starting to feel dizzy from the cold, and she nodded, and Daniel moved closer and sat beside her, and he was right, and heat radiated from him, and she instinctively leaned toward that warmth. Daniel wrapped an outer blanket around both of them and kept a respectful distance, but his body heat reached her, and slowly the shivering stopped, and Vela felt her core temperature stabilizing, and she was so tired, and the warmth and the sound of rain on the roof and the crackling fire all combined to make her drowsy. She did not mean to fall asleep, but she did, and when she woke in the night she found she had curled against Daniel's side, and his arm was carefully supporting her to keep her from falling, and he was still awake watching the fire and keeping it fed. Vela should have pulled away, but she did not, and she felt safer than she had since the crash, and Daniel looked down at her and asked quietly if she was warm enough, and she nodded and said, "Thank you," in his language, and he smiled that gentle smile. The storm continued through the night, and Vela drifted in and out of sleep, and always Daniel was there keeping her warm and tending the fire, and she realized something profound, and this human had shown her more kindness than many of her own people, and he had protected her and respected her and asked for nothing in return. Morning came with clearing skies, and Vela woke fully to find herself still leaning against Daniel, and he had dark circles under his eyes from staying awake all night, and she felt guilty that he had sacrificed his sleep for her comfort. She sat up, and Daniel stretched stiffly and said good morning, and asked how she felt, and Vela said she felt much better thanks to him, and the words seemed inadequate for what he had done. They had breakfast together, and the storm had passed, and Daniel said he would take her back to check on the pod and the shelter, and Vela realized she did not want to go back to being alone, and that was a dangerous feeling. When they returned to her pod area, they found the tarp shelter had collapsed, and the pod had taken more damage from falling branches, and Vela felt despair because how would she ever repair it? Now, Daniel put a hand on her shoulder, and she did not flinch away, and he said they would figure it out together, and that word together made something warm bloom in Vela's chest, and she looked up at him and saw determination in his face, and she thought, maybe everything would be all right. Over the following weeks, Daniel helped Vela repair the communication system in her pod, and they worked side by side every day, and Vela learned that Daniel was not just kind but also intelligent and creative, and he understood technology in intuitive ways even though his people were centuries behind Harrell in advancement. Daniel showed her the beauty of his planet and took her on walks through the forest and taught her the names of plants and animals and showed her hidden waterfalls and meadows full of flowers, and Vela had lived in a palace all her life and never knew such simple beauty existed. She taught him about the stars and her people and showed him star charts on her repaired scanner and explained how her empire had grown through peaceful contact and trade, and Daniel listened with wonder and asked about other species and what they were like. One afternoon while they were working on the pod, Daniel asked about her family, and Vela's face fell, and she explained that her parents had arranged a marriage for her to a nobleman named Korath, who was cruel and ambitious, and she had refused and they had insisted, and finally, she had stolen a pod and fled. She had not meant to crash on Earth, and her navigation system had malfunctioned, and now she was stranded and she did not know if that was bad luck or good fortune. And Daniel said quietly that he was glad she crashed here, and then looked embarrassed. Vela felt her bioluminescent patterns glow brighter, and she asked why he was glad, and Daniel was quiet for a moment, and then he said because he had been alone for a long time and meeting her had reminded him what it felt like to care about someone. He told her about his past and how he had lost his wife and daughter in an accident years ago, and the grief had driven him into the mountains away from people, and he had lived in solitude ever since, and he had thought he wanted to be alone forever. But Vela had changed. That Vela felt her heart ache for his loss, and she reached out carefully and touched his hand, and the contact sent warmth through her whole body. And Daniel looked at their joined hands, and then at her face, and something passed between them that neither could name, but both felt. The communication system finally came online, and Vela sent out a stronger distress signal that would reach any Harrellan ship within several light years, and she should have felt relieved. But instead she felt conflicted, and the signal meant rescue, but rescue meant leaving Earth and leaving Daniel. They sat by the fire that evening and the mood was somber, and Daniel asked how long until her people found her, and Vela said it could be weeks or months depending on patrol routes, and Daniel nodded and stared. Into the flames Vela wanted to say something, but did not know what, and her feelings were confused, and among her people bonding between herbivores and predator species was unheard of, and yet she could not deny what she felt when she was with Daniel. Finally, Daniel spoke, and he asked if Harrellan people ever bonded with other species, and Vela explained that her species was dying slowly, and their genetic diversity was too narrow after centuries of isolation, and scientists had theorized that bonding with other species might be possible with the right genetic compatibility, but no one had ever tried. Daniel looked at her with hope and fear mixed in his expression, and he asked the question that made Vela's heart race, and he asked if she felt for him what he felt for her, and if she would want to try even though their species were different. Vela looked into his eyes and saw genuine love and care, and she thought about how he had protected her and respected her and made her laugh and showed her patience when her fear made her difficult, and she realized she had fallen in love with this human male. She answered yes, in both their languages, and Daniel smiled that smile she had come to love, and he cupped her face so gently, like she was precious, and he kissed her forehead, and Vela patterns blazed with light and happiness. They talked late into the night about what it would mean and the challenges they would face, and Vela said her people would need to do genetic testing to see if human and Harrellan biology were compatible, and Daniel said he would do whatever tests were needed. Vela said she could not return to her empire and marry Korath, and she would claim asylum on Earth if necessary, and Daniel said his planet would probably welcome contact with peaceful aliens and she could stay as long as she wanted. They fell asleep by the fire curled together, and Vela felt complete for the first time in her life. And she had thought the crash was a disaster, but maybe it was the universe giving her a gift. The weeks passed and they grew closer, and Vela learned human customs and Daniel learned Harrellan traditions, and they taught each other their languages, and they explored the mountains together, and every day, Vela loved him more. She stopped hoping for rescue and started hoping her people would not find her too soon, and she wanted time to be with Daniel and learn everything about him and his world. But the universe had other plans, and one morning Vela emergency beacon began receiving a response signal, and a Harrellan ship was approaching, and would arrive within 2 days. Vela felt panic and joy mixed together, and she would see her people again, but she did not want to leave Daniel. And when she told him about the ship, he looked sad but understanding. That night they held each other and made promises, and Daniel said he would fight for her if she wanted to stay. And Vela said she would fight for him if her people tried to separate them. They decided, together, and when the ship arrived, Vela would claim Daniel as her chosen bondmate, and she would undergo genetic testing, and if the tests showed compatibility, she would ask Earth and the Empire to recognize their union. It was a risk, and both species might reject them, and Vela might lose her title, and Daniel might be seen as an enemy. But they decided it was worth it, on the morning the ship was due to arrive. Daniel and Vela stood together hand in hand and watched the sky, and Vela wore her torn flight suit that marked her as royalty, and Daniel wore his best clothes, and they waited. The Heralin ship descended silently and landed in the clearing, and the door opened, and diplomatic envoys emerged, and they saw Vela and rushed forward and then stopped when they saw the human holding her hand. The lead envoy, whose name was Taral, demanded to know what was happening and why the princess was touching an alien, and Vela drew herself up to her full height and spoke with royal authority. She explained everything, and her crash, and Daniel's kindness, and her decision to bond with him, and her request for genetic testing and asylum if necessary. And Taral looked shocked, and the other envoys whispered among themselves. Taral said, this was unprecedented and impossible, and the Empire would never accept a human bondmate. And Vela said then she would renounce her title and stay on Earth. Daniel squeezed her hand and stood tall, and said that humans would welcome her and protect her, and his people believed in love and choice. The standoff lasted for several tense minutes, and finally Taral said he would send the request to the Imperial Council and they would decide, and in the meantime Vela should return to the ship. Vela refused and said she would stay with Daniel until the decision was made, and Taral looked frustrated but could not force a princess, and he returned to the ship to send communications. Daniel and Vela waited together, and they did not know what the future would hold, but they knew they would face it together, and that was enough. 3 days passed while the Imperial Council debated, and Daniel and Vela stayed at his cabin and tried not to think about rejection, and they held each other and made plans for every possible outcome, and the waiting was the hardest thing either of them had endured. Finally Taral returned with news, and he looked grave and said the council had made their decision, and Vela gripped Daniel's hand so hard it must have hurt, but he did not pull away. Taral said the council recognized that the Heralin species was facing a genetic crisis, and they were willing to consider bonding with other species if it could save their people, and they would allow genetic testing between Vela and Daniel, but if the tests showed incompatibility, Vela must return immediately and marry Korath as planned. Vela felt relief and dread mixed together, and she agreed to the terms, and Taral brought medical equipment from the ship and took samples from both Vela and Daniel, and said the results would take several hours. Those hours stretched like years, and Daniel made tea, and they sat together and talked about meaningless things to avoid thinking about the test, and Vela patterns flickered with anxiety, and Daniel thumb traced circles on her hand to comfort her. When Taral returned, he looked stunned, and he said the results were remarkable and human, and Heralin DNA could combine successfully. And in fact, humans were more genetically compatible with Heralins than many species they had encountered. The news sent ripples through both groups, and the other envoys gathered around and examined the data and confirmed it. And suddenly everything changed, and what had been impossible was now possible. Taral said the council had given provisional approval for the bonding, and Vela would need to return to the homeworld for an official ceremony and to present Daniel to the imperial court, and if the court accepted him, they would be bonded under Heralin law. Vela asked if she could bring Daniel to Earth authorities first to explain and to get approval from his people, and Taral agreed, and they would wait 1 week for Earth response. The next days were a whirlwind, and Daniel contacted Earth governments and explained that aliens existed, and one of them wanted to bond with him. And predictably, the governments were skeptical until the Heralin ship revealed itself publicly. Earth went into chaos and excitement and fear and wonder all mixed together, and first contact protocols that had been theoretical suddenly became real, and diplomats scrambled to meet with the Heralin envoys. Daniel and Vela stood at the center of it all, and they gave interviews and explained their story, and answered endless questions, and some humans were supportive and some were fearful and some were hostile, but the majority were curious. Earth governments finally agreed to allow the bonding, and they saw it as an opportunity for peaceful relations with an advanced species, and they appointed Daniel as an unofficial ambassador and gave him resources and support. With both people's approval, Vela and Daniel traveled to the Herolin homeworld, and Vela had not seen her home in months, and when they arrived, she felt conflicting emotions, and the palace was as beautiful as she remembered, but now it felt confining. The imperial court gathered to meet the human, and Daniel stood before them in formal clothes and showed respect, but did not bow because humans did not bow to foreign rulers, and some court members were offended, but others were intrigued. Vela spoke before the court and explained everything, and she talked about Daniel's kindness and strength and intelligence, and she said he represented the best of his species, and she loved him and she would bond with him with or without their approval, but she hoped they would bless the union. The emperor, who was Vela's distant cousin, stood and looked at Daniel for a long moment, and then he asked Daniel what he could offer the empire, and Daniel answered honestly. He said he could not offer wealth or military power, and he could not offer advanced technology or political advantage, and all he could offer was respect and love for Vela, and a bridge between their peoples, and a hope that humans and Herolins could learn from each other. The emperor smiled slightly and said that was more than most nobles offered, and he granted his blessing, and the court erupted in whispers, and Vela felt tears of joy, and Daniel looked relieved. Bonding ceremony was held 3 days later, and it combined both human and Herolin traditions, and Vela wore traditional royal garments that shimmered with her bioluminescent patterns, and Daniel wore formal clothes from Earth, and they exchanged vows in both languages. When they were pronounced bonded, Vela patterns blazed brighter than ever before, and Daniel kissed her gently, and the court applauded, and both species watching from across space celebrated. The news spread through both civilizations, and Princess Vela and Daniel Hayes became symbols of hope and proof that different species could find common ground, and their bonding opened doors for more cultural exchange. Vela gave up her place in the succession, and she and Daniel returned to Earth and built a home in the mountains near where they first met, and they became ambassadors for both peoples and helped facilitate first contact protocols. The genetic compatibility between humans and Herolins attracted scientific interest, and more bonding partnerships formed, and genetic diversity slowly returned to the Herolin species, and humans gained access to new knowledge and perspectives. 2 years later, Vela gave birth to their daughter, and she had her mother lavender skin, with her father dark eyes, and her birth was celebrated on both worlds, and she represented the future and hope and possibility. The child grew up speaking both languages and learning both cultures, and she would later bridge worlds in ways her parents never imagined, and she was the first of many children born from human-Herolin bonds. Vela never forgot that first morning when she had crashed on Earth, terrified and alone, and had seen Daniel and thought he would harm her, and how wrong fear had been, and she never forgot how courage meant trusting someone different, and how love could overcome instinct. Daniel never forgot the day he found an alien princess in the forest, and how she had been afraid of him, and how patience and kindness had won her trust, and how she had changed his life completely and given him purpose again. Together, they proved that the universe was full of possibilities, and that sometimes the most terrifying moment leads to the most beautiful future, and their story became legend among both species and inspired countless others to look beyond their differences and choose understanding over fear. The herbivore princess and the human from the mountains showed two civilizations that predator and prey were just words, and that individuals could write their own stories, and that love recognized no boundaries between species or worlds. And in the end, that was their greatest gift to both peoples, and the knowledge that the universe was vast and full of wonders, and that reaching across the darkness to touch another being was always worth the risk.